The chickens were killing themselves against the walls of the barn. 6 to 10 in a single day, at the worst of it. About 150 in all. They panicked and flew into the walls because of what kept passing overhead. Military aircraft, bombers mostly. But no plane ever crashed on that farm. Nobody from the government ever set foot on it. And in 1946, the Supreme Court said they had taken it anyway. This is the case that decided who owns the sky above your house, and what happened to the man who won it. Start with the ground. 2.8 acres, just outside Greensboro, North Carolina. A dwelling house and outbuildings mainly used for raising chickens. It belonged to a man named Cosby and to his wife. They bought it in 1934 and raised chickens commercially. That was the income. And there was an airport nearby. The end of one runway sat 2,220 feet from their barn, which on its own is not close enough to matter. What mattered was the angle. A plane does not drop onto a runway. It comes down a slope called the path of glide. The safe slope approved by the Civil Aeronautics Authority was 30 to 1. 30 feet forward for every 1 foot down, a long, shallow ramp of air. Run that ramp back from the runway, and it passes directly over the Cosby property. At 83 feet. That put it 67 feet above their house, 63 feet above the barn, and 18 feet above the tallest tree on the property. 18 feet, that measurement is the entire case. In May of 1942, the United States leased that airport. The initial term was 1 month, June 1st to June 30th. 1 month with an option to renew and renew all the way to 1967. A month at a time, potentially for 25 years. Then the aircraft came, bombers, transports, and fighters, including 4 motored heavy bombers. That runway was used about 4% of the time for takeoffs, 7% for landings. Which sounds like very little until you were the one standing underneath it. The court's own description is that planes came close enough to appear barely to miss the tops of the trees, and at times so close as to blow the old leaves off. Blow the leaves off the trees. That is the Supreme Court describing it. The noise, the opinion says, is startling. And at night, the glare from the landing lights brightly lights up the place. Picture it, a farmhouse in the dark, and every few minutes the whole yard goes white. The chickens could not take it. The ones that survived stopped laying, production fell off. And then the business ended. The court calls it the destruction of the use of the property as a commercial chicken farm. The family lost sleep. The record says they became nervous and frightened. But the land was still theirs. They still lived on it. Nobody had taken anything you could point at. The Fifth Amendment ends with a promise. Private property shall not be taken for public use without just compensation. In plain English, the government can take your property, but it has to pay a fair price. The picture that comes with that sentence is physical. A highway comes through. Someone arrives with paperwork, and you get a check. Cosby had none of that. No seizure, no occupation. He still owned every inch. To get paid, he had to convince a court that something had been taken that nobody had ever touched. He sued in the Court of Claims, which hears money claims against the United States. And he won. That court found the government had taken an easement over his property. An easement is a right to use land you do not own, a path across a field. Here, the right to fly through the air just above a chicken farm. They valued the property destroyed and the easement taken at $2,000. Hold on to that number. It does not survive this story. And the decision was not unanimous. One judge dissented. His name was Madden. Madden's objection is the strongest version of the other side. When railroads were new, he wrote, cattle in fields within sight and hearing of the trains were alarmed. These sights and noises are a part of our world, he wrote, and airplanes are now, and will be to a greater degree, likewise a part of it. In other words, the world gets louder. That is not a taking. That is just the century arriving. The United States appealed, and the Supreme Court took the case. Congress had declared that the United States has complete and exclusive national sovereignty in the airspace over this country. It had also given every citizen a public right of freedom of transit through what it called the navigable airspace. Navigable airspace meant the air above the minimum safe altitudes set by the aviation regulators. So, the government's position was simple. These flights were lawful, and nothing touched the ground. No physical invasion, no taking. At most, incidental damage, which the Constitution does not pay for. And one more argument, the one to remember. A landowner, the government said, does not own the airspace above him that he has not taken possession of by building in it. The opinion came from Justice William O. Douglas. He began by killing a rule that had stood for centuries. At common law, owning land meant owning the column of space above it, all of it. The Latin is cujus est solum ejus est usque ad coelum. Whose is the soil, his it is up to the sky. Lawyers summarized it as ownership to the periphery of the universe, your property line, extended straight up, forever. Under that rule, Cosby owned the air above his farm, out past the clouds. Douglas wrote that the doctrine has no place in the modern world. Every transcontinental flight would cross thousands of private properties, and every owner could sue for trespass. Common sense, the court said, revolts at the idea. The air is a public highway. That much the government won. But that is where the government's argument stopped working, and it stopped because of something the government itself said. At oral argument, the United States conceded that if the flights had made the property uninhabitable, that would be a taking it had to pay for. Which meant the question was no longer whether low flights could take property, only how much interference it takes. And on that, Douglas had an answer. If the landowner is to have full enjoyment of the land, he wrote, he must have exclusive control of the immediate reaches of the enveloping atmosphere. In plain English, you own enough of the air over your land to actually use your land. Otherwise, as he put it, buildings could not be erected, trees could not be planted, and even fences could not be run. Think about what a fence is. It is something you own that occupies the air above your dirt. So is a barn. So is a tree. The landowner owns at least as much of the space above the ground as he can occupy or use in connection with the land. Not to the periphery of the universe, as far up as you can genuinely use. If the government had built an elevated railway over that farm at the exact height its planes flew, that would plainly be a partial taking. The planes were doing the same thing. They just were not leaving anything behind. The court quoted an older case. It is the character of the invasion, not the amount of the damage, that decides whether there is a taking. And here is the sentence the whole case exists to deliver. Flights over private land are not a taking unless they are so low and so frequent as to be a direct and immediate interference with the enjoyment and use of the land. So low and so frequent, both. One plane, however low, is not enough. A constant stream far overhead is not enough either. And notice what the court refused to do. It never named an altitude. It said twice that it was not setting those precise limits. There is no magic number where your property stops and the public sky begins. There is a test, and it turns on your land and what is happening over it. Two justices did not go along. Justice Hugo Black dissented, and Justice Harold Burton joined him. Black's concern was not chickens. It was who gets to draw these lines. He argued the decision would limit, by the imposition of relatively absolute constitutional barriers, future adjustments through legislation and regulation as air travel grew. In plain English, by making this a constitutional rule, the court had taken the problem away from Congress and frozen it. Air travel was about to explode. Black thought lawmakers should draw those lines, because they can change a rule next year. Judges mostly cannot. And since, in my view, the Constitution does not contain such barriers, he wrote, I dissent. The vote was 5-2, which does not add up to 9, and there are two reasons. Justice Robert Jackson took no part. The opinion does not say why. But he spent that entire term of the court at Nuremberg, serving as chief American prosecutor of Nazi war criminals. And the Chief Justice's chair was empty. Harlan Fiske Stone had died in office that April. Cosby was argued 9 days later, decided a month after that, and his successor was not sworn in until June. So, this was decided by 7 justices on a Supreme Court 2 members short. Cosby won. The court agreed his property had been taken, and that the Constitution required him to be paid. And then it took his judgment away. Not because it doubted him. It said plainly that it agreed a servitude had been imposed on his land. The problem was the paperwork. The Court of Claims had never written down what exactly had been taken, permanent or temporary, for how long. The lower court had simply called it permanent, reasoning the government no doubt intended to keep using the airport. That, said the Supreme Court, sounds more like conjecture rather than a conclusion from evidence. So, the $2,000 did not stand. The court neither approved it nor rejected it. It said ruling on the amount would be premature. Reversed, sent back down, start the findings over. There is a footnote in the opinion that lands differently once you know that. The court leaned on an earlier case from 1922, where the same principle had been recognized. And it noted what happened to that landowner afterward. On remand, his allegations were found not supported by the facts. He won the principle and then lost once the facts were tested. That footnote is about that earlier case, not about Cosby, but the court put it there anyway. A quiet reminder, inside its own opinion, that winning the rule and getting paid are two different things. You do not own the sky, but you own the part of it you can actually use. And the government cannot fly through that part so low and so often that it destroys what you built without paying for it. That rule came out of 2.8 acres, 1 runway, and about 150 chickens. And a man nobody from the government ever set foot on the land of, who had it taken anyway.